Welcome to your introduction to epidemiology. So epidemiology is the science that evaluates the occurrence, determinants, distribution, and control of health and disease in a human population. The thing is, pandemics have actually been around for a really long time, but it wasn't until opening trade routes and the shift to an agrarian population or way of living that we really see disease spread more drastically throughout populations. So if we go back in time looking at this image from the World Health Forum, we can see that there's been epidemics killing off actually a really large part of the population. Like look at the Black Death or the bubonic plague. 200 million people died, and you have to take into account that the population was not as large as it was now. I believe it was somewhere around like 40 to 50% of the entire population is estimated to have died at that time. As we move forward along the timeline, you can see that we still have diseases that are really prevalent in the population and making a really big impact. However, generally speaking, the impact of disease seems to have really declined over time. So why would that be? We can chalk it up to mainly two things. I think the most obvious is probably that we have modern medicine, right? It was kind of relatively recently that we actually had antibiotics developed in the 1900s. So we have that to thank for a decline in overall illness and disease. We also have a general understanding of how disease spreads. So going back, the leading theory for why people got sick was miasma theory. Generally speaking, it's like these, kind of spirity death clouds would get you sick. We didn't really know what microbes were at the time. Fast forward to now, we have germ theory, and it's this understanding that passing microbes between people is a way that we transmit illness. So understanding how diseases develop, spread throughout a population, and spread between people is crucial to being able to prevent them and then also take action when they occur in a population.
Epidemiology is a field with many parts. Epidemiologists monitor public health, which can include gathering data and analyzing morbidity and mortality. Morbidity refers to the state of being ill or diseased, so this measures the number of people who are sick or injured within a given population. Mortality, on the other hand, refers to actual deaths, so this measures the number of people who die from a specific disease or a condition in a given population. It focuses more on fatal outcomes. Then, that data is used to take action. Epidemiologists respond to disease outbreaks, epidemics, and pandemics, all of which we will broadly distinguish between soon. This involves determining the cause of the outbreaks and implementing measures to control the disease outbreak itself. Lastly, epidemiologists are continuously investigating and monitoring emerging and re-emerging disease. We can try to take a preventative approach to emerging diseases by determining risk factors and recommending control measures accordingly. In the US, the CDC, which stands for the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, serves as the national agency for developing and carrying out disease prevention and control, environmental health, and health promotion and educational activities. At an international level, we have the World Health Organization, or the WHO, with their headquarters in Switzerland. As of creating this video, the CDC in the US has been hit with massive budget cuts and cuts to staffing, so this is really raising the alarm for impact on current public health education programs and just generally capability to respond to national, current, and emerging threats like local outbreaks, epidemics, and pandemics. But hold on, what are these terms like epidemic and pandemic? What's the difference? Let's find out. Diseases can be categorized based off of their distribution within and among populations. Let's start with the word endemic. So this is when it maintains a steady, low-level frequency at a moderately regular interval. Think of things like the common cold, maybe the flu, syphilis, herpes, other STIs. They're kind of just happening all the time. I also want to point out that endemic in this context is not the same as the use of the word endemic in an ecological context, which usually means we're referring to a species that's found in one place and nowhere else. So this is a little different. We also have the term sporadic. This is when a disease occurs occasionally or at irregular intervals in a human population. Think of something like rabies. It's not very common and it kind of pops up here or there. There's no real pattern to its distribution. We can also think of something like tetanus or bacterial meningitis. I'm sure you've all heard of the word outbreak. So this is the sudden, unexpected occurrence of a disease, usually in a limited segment of the population. For example, maybe there's an outbreak of contaminated lettuce and a bunch of people eat it. Epidemic is a type of outbreak, but it's affecting many people all at once. So influenza can often achieve epidemic status in a community, especially when it changes over time. Looking back, January 2015, there was a really big measles outbreak that took people by surprise. There were 159 cases, 70% of which were determined to have come from earlier exposure at Disneyland. The majority of individuals impacted were either unvaccinated or had unknown vaccination status. Actually, measles outbreaks have become increasingly more common as of recently, so this video in 2025, which many people are chalking up to fear surrounding vaccinations. According to the CDC, there have been 43 outbreaks of measles reported in 2025, and that's up from an already high 16 outbreaks in 2024. Lastly, we have the term pandemic. I'm sure at this point we are all very familiar with this term after the COVID-19 pandemic, but this is an increase in disease occurrence within a large population over at least 2 countries around the world. We can think about the Black Death, which was the bubonic plague that lasted 4 years in the 14th century and killed somewhere from 30 to 50% of the total population. The Spanish flu in 1918 is super famous. It killed 50 million people and lasted 2 years. That's a huge proportion of the population. Or the current AIDS pandemic, which has claimed over 40 million lives since the first reported cases in 1981.
Public health is the science of protecting populations and improving the health of communities through education, promotion of healthy lifestyles, and prevention of disease. It follows an approach that really mimics the scientific method. So we start with identifying a health problem within a population, determining the cause, proposing preventative and corrective action, then actually taking and implementing that action, and assessing outcomes of the action so that we can revise if necessary.
Let's say there's an unknown epidemic. We can learn a lot about what's causing an epidemic by looking at occurrence of the disease or illness over time. These are called epidemic curves. So the y-axis is typically number of individuals infected, and the x-axis would be time. Common source epidemics can be categorized into 2 types: point source and common continuous source. Point source epidemics are characterized as having reached a peak level within a short period of time, usually around 1 to 2 weeks, followed by a moderate, rapid decline in number of infected patients. This usually resulted from a single common contaminated food source or water source. Common continuous sources are very similar. However, they go on for a more prolonged period of time. So let's say there's a case of food poisoning, we identify it quickly, and it gets taken care of. We'll see that really short peak for a point source. But what if there is an unknown contaminated water source and people are drinking out of it for weeks on weeks? We would see a similar sharp rise in cases, but it is sustained for a longer period of time. In contrast, there's also propagated epidemic curves. These are relatively slow and prolonged rises and then a gradual decline in number of individuals infected. The difference between common continuous source and propagated epidemics is that for a propagated epidemic curve, it's typically resulting from an infection that is passed from person to person. So it starts when there's the introduction of a single infected individual into a susceptible population. The initial infection is propagated to others in a gradual fashion until many individuals within the population are infected. An example of this would be like an increase in influenza cases that coincide with the return of college students after their winter break. I also want to point out that more specifically in a propagated epidemic curve, usually there's a series of successively larger peaks, such that the peaks are 1 incubation period apart. The successive waves involve more and more people, but may start to decline as more people recover and gain immunity, or things like control measures are implemented in the population.
So how can we predict whether a disease will become an outbreak and how it's going to spread throughout a population? Well, we use something called the basic reproductive number, or R0, which is that R sub 0. What this is essentially telling us is, as an infected individual, how many people will be infected by that single person on average. So average number of secondary infections. And something really important is that when calculating this mathematical value, we are doing so under the assumption that it only applies when everybody in the population is completely vulnerable to the disease. That means no one has been vaccinated, no one has had the disease before, maybe it's completely new, and there's no way to control the spread. So if the R naught, or basic reproductive number, is below 1, that means it's likely not to be an issue in the population. It's probably not going to cause many new infections. We might see it kind of fizzle out. We're not as concerned.
If the basic reproduction number, or R naught, is approaching 1 or equals 1, each existing infection causes one new infection. So the disease will stay alive and stable, but there won't necessarily be an outbreak or an epidemic likely.
If we're getting above 1, that is when we are concerned and we are likely to see an epidemic or a pandemic. So you'll notice COVID-19 has a value of 2.5. So that means if you're like, 0.5, how are you infecting half of a person? It's an average value. So if I was an infected individual, I on average would be infecting 2 to 3 other individuals. And then even, I just want to point out, take a look at measles. The basic reproductive number is 16. This is a highly, highly contagious disease. So if that value is above 1, we're looking to find a vaccination as soon as possible. And hopefully we can even get enough people vaccinated, if that's appropriate given the disease, that we could build some sort of herd immunity in the population. I also want to point out that epidemiologists are trying to implement measures and make recommendations in a population that help break the chain of infection. And that can happen on many levels. So we have a susceptible host and an infectious pathogen. There might be a reservoir where this microbe or virus can thrive without infecting the individuals or environment that it is in. There has to be some sort of portal of exit. So for COVID-19, which we're all very familiar with, if I'm coughing, that's the way that the virus can exit my body. There has to be a portal of entry to another person and a means of transmission between the two people. The more I know about all of the steps and life cycle or transmission of the infectious agent, the more I can develop methods to try to break this chain of infection. So when it came to COVID-19, there was various measures taken to try to break this chain of infection at different points. So we would wear masks to try to target the portal of entry and the portal of exit, right? And kind of break up that means of transmission once we found out that it was transmitted through respiratory droplets. We also knew that the susceptible hosts were able to pass it along when they were in close contact with people. So we would do things like social distancing and quarantining. Do things like social distancing and quarantining once we learned about the incubation period for the virus. So just to summarize, the more we know, the more measures we're able to come up with to help keep people safe within a population.